Hey guys, so for our first official lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about what conservation biology is, a little bit about the history of conservation biology, conservation ethics, and some of the laws that have been put forth in conservation biology. So when you think about conservation biology, there might be a few different words that come to mind. Some people think of ecologists, some people think of environmentalists or preservationists or conservationists. And all of these terms have differences. Ecologists study the relationships between organisms and their environment. Environmentalists are more concerned with the impact that people have on the environment. Preservationists advocate for putting things aside to be protected forever, and conservationists advocate for a practice to practice careful use of natural resources. So conservation biology, though, is kind of a mix of all these things. You need all of these things. And conservation biology is considered the applied approach of maintaining the Earth's biological diversity. So all of these other titles are equally as important when you want to really understand conservation biology. So there's a lot that goes into conservation biology. We draw from all different subjects. So really, there's a ton of different jobs you can get in conservation biology. You can work in any of these other departments. You can work in the biological sciences, so biology, zoology, botany, ecology, the applied management sciences, wildlife, forestry, range, and fisheries. But you can also be in some things you probably wouldn't even think of, such as law, or planning, or engineering, geography, geology, physics, sociology, economics. All of these things come into play with conservation biology. So it's really a broad topic that pulls in from everywhere. Well, there definitely were people who advocated for protecting species and the environment for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. Conservation biology kind of didn't become a large topic of concern until the 1960s and 1970s. So in the 1960s and 70s, there was a pretty large movement. It's when we saw the first Earth Day. It's when the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act were enacted. It was pretty much the largest turning point for conservation biology. But in 1978, the first International Conference on Conservation Biology occurred. And at that time, it was simply a banquet for scientists, zookeepers, conservationists, but it ended up becoming so much more. And scientists started noticing that the organisms they used to find were disappearing. The iguana just fell. So the organisms that they used to find were disappearing. And a biologist named Michael Soule came forward and he pled with his colleagues that they should join together to start to save species that needed our help. At that time, the extinction rates were estimated to be the highest that they ever were in the last 65 million years. So that's since the last major extinction. And something needed to be done. And the sad thing is it's just gone up from there. So we've been trying, but the extinction rate is increasing as we speak. And we'll talk more about all of that later in the course. So it was that meeting, though, that sparked interest in conservation biology. And just 2 years later, the most important publication in this field, arguably, was released. And that was the publication of Conservation Biology, an evolutionary ecological perspective. And that was written by Soule, that one who brought up this whole thing in the international conference, and Wilcox. So just 6 years after that, in 1986, the Society for Conservation Biology was formed. And in 1987, the first Journal of Conservation Biology was created. So this is when conservation biology really became an applied science. They used scientific techniques to accomplish things in a real world setting. Before that, it was mostly people just trying to change their ways and talking about it, but we didn't really start true scientific studies until around then. And when you think about it, that's really not that long ago to have started all of this. So another thing that Soule did is he proposed 4 postulates of conservation biology. And the first one was that diversity of organisms is good. And the inverse of that, of course, would be that the unnatural loss of diversity or extinction is bad. The second postulate was that ecological complexity is good. So there's a preference for nature over artifice or artificial circumstances. And you really want wilderness over managed gardens or agricultural fields. And simplification of ecosystems is considered bad. So you don't want monocultures. You don't want to turn things into, developments. You really want to keep the complex ecosystem intact. The third postulate was that evolution is good. So maintenance of significant genetic diversity so organs can adapt and evolve in their changing environment is really important. Interference with the evolutionary processes is bad, so reducing genetic diversity to the point that animals can't adapt to the biological changes. And the fourth postulate was that biodiversity has intrinsic value. So what that means, we're gonna get into intrinsic value a lot in a few minutes. It means that biodiversity has value in and of itself. It's not based on what it gives us. It's based on the fact that it deserves to be around just because. So another hypothesis that we should talk about was put forth by E.O. Wilson. And you'll probably hear a lot about E.O. Wilson. He's a very famous conservationist. He was very important in making conservation biology become what it is today. And he came up with this idea of the biophilia hypothesis. And the root bio, of course, means life. Philia means love. So it really means love of life. And what this is saying is that humans have an inherent or genetically based need for the natural life around us. And that's a product of our biological evolution. So that can explain why people go out of their way to care for domestic animals. It's why we like having pets, why we have houseplants, why we give each other flowers as gifts. So our natural love for life is kind of helping sustain certain forms of life. Conservation biology is a multidisciplinary science. So it's an inexact science. It's always changing. It's a science that works on an evolutionary time scale. And we need to keep working at it. And the fact that we have this natural love for nature could be a really great motivator for people to work for conservation biology, even if it's someone who's not in the field. It's a great tool to get people involved. So that's why when people go into grocery stores and they see a little jar and it says donate for puppies, they're probably pretty likely to put a couple pieces of change in that jar, because we love certain aspects of nature. Well, that's not saying everybody. I know there are some people out there who hate all nature, but typically it's something that's inherent in us. So now we're going to get into some conservation laws and ethics. So from all the effort that we talked about in the history, it really led to a new set of conservation laws that were developed. So laws are really rooted in our ethics and our values. So values are the basis for how we estimate what something is worth. And ethics are the organizations of those values that establish the principles for how we're going to behave. So we behave in a way that represents our values. Conservation biologists, it's our job to convince the public that biodiversity has value and that it's worth them helping. So you might think, what can you tell people? Why should they just conserve biodiversity? So there's two routes that you can go. The first one would be, what does nature do for us? And we call those types of values instrumental values. Then you can think about the fact that nature has its own rights. It doesn't matter if it gives something to us. It deserves the ability to be here. And that is its intrinsic value, its value in and of itself. So utilitarian or instrumental values. Some examples are some goods that nature can give us, right? Like food, fuel, building materials, medicine, the services that they give us, water for purification, nutrient cycling, oxygen production, nitrogen fixation and pollination, information that they can give us, so genetic diversity, applied biotechnology, and psychospiritual. So that's something that people don't usually think of when they think of instrumental value, but it really is one of our instrumental values. It's the aesthetic value. So people that enjoy being out in nature just to look at it. That's not, it might sound like it might be an intrinsic value, but it's not, because we are getting something out of it. We are getting that happiness that we feel from looking at it. Also, religious value. So there's certain areas of nature that are considered areas for religious outings. So, and also scientific knowledge. So those are some psychospiritual utilitarian values. So there's a lot of things, like I said, instrumental or utilitarian values. There are a lot of things that you might not think of right away, but there's some that are pretty typical, like hunting, so food, logging. Even though we are actually getting rid of nature there, nature needs to be there in the first place for us to be able to use the wood and paper. And, they'll replant some trees and grow things up again. So that's a value of nature. Fishing, and then recreation like rock climbing, snowboarding. Those are all things that convince people that nature has value because they're getting something out of it. Then we have intrinsic value. So intrinsic value is the inherent value that something has in and for itself. It does not matter if it's a tick or it's a tiger. Even the land itself has value. It doesn't need to give us anything for it to have value. It has the right to exist in and of itself. And sometimes people like to pick and choose what has intrinsic value. So a lot of people might disagree that ticks have value because they actually can do us harm. So when something does us harm, people might not believe it really has value. But really intrinsic value is that everything in nature has value. So there are some laws. We're going to go through these. And we're going to get all of these into more detail, but some really large legal foundations that came forth are the Lacey Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and CITES. And we're going to talk about each of those in quite a bit of detail. So first, we're going to talk about the ethics that come into creating these laws. So conservation ethics are a very large topic in conservation biology. An ethic is considered a set of principles of right conduct or a theory or system of moral values. And in conservation biology, the second definition is kind of what comes in. So Caldecott, who you will see more about later, and he's actually one of your supplemental readings if you want to read a paper by him. He said that American conservation begins as an essentially moral movement and has ever since orbited around several ethical foci. So there are three main conservation ethics that we have in conservation biology. The first one is the romantic transcendental preservation ethic. I know it's a mouthful. It's a pretty long name. Then we have the resource conservation ethic and the ecological evolutionary land ethic, which is what your reading this week is about. So in a Sand County Almanac, you'll read about the land ethic. So these are supposed to be reasons why we should be conservationists. And the first one, the romantic transcendental preservation ethic, it was derived from the writings of two transcendentalists named Emerson and Thoreau. And John Muir, actually developed their writings into a campaign to preserve nature. He valued nature for its spiritual and aesthetic value. So he was heavily influenced by spiritual concerns, and he viewed nature as a temple. So he had a kind of anthropocentric view on nature. And if you haven't heard that word before, that's a word we're going to mention a lot in this class. So anthropocentric, the roots anthrop means human, and centrics means centered. So it's a human-centered view. It's something that we're looking at from something that can benefit us, or something that we're seeing from our perspective instead of being impartial. So he was criticized for being an elitist because his view was that all of the land should not be used at all. And that's ideally great, right? We're not destroying any land. We're not getting rid of any habitat. We're not hurting any animals. But when you think about it, it's really not realistic, because we're always going to be using things from nature, right? We are part of the ecosystem. We do use things from nature. So you can't just cut off all nature. So it was an elitist view, something that maybe he could afford to do just himself, but not something that would make sense for society. The next ethic that came forth was the resource conservation ethic. And this ethic was about conserving resources, not preserving them. So the last one was about preserving the environment, not touching it. This one is about conserving them. So using them in a way that is going to give you the greatest good of the greatest number for the longest time. So keeping things from going extinct, but never touching the environment, right? We can still use the environment. And this was put forth by Gifford Pinchot. He was the governor of Pennsylvania. He trained in Europe as a forester, and he was actually the first head of the U.S. Forest Service. So he was a big part in the U.S. forestry. He actually developed a forestry school in Pennsylvania, in Milford, PA. It's about a little over 2 hours from here, at a place called Gray Towers. You can actually still visit Gray Towers. They do tours. They have festivals there. I've been there quite a few times, actually, because I lived not too far away. And he used Gray Towers as a place to train foresters. He also developed the first school of forestry at Yale. So he was very involved in the environment, and he saw nature as a means to acquire natural resources. But he recognized that if we just go out and take things as much as we want, we're not going to have anything left. So he did have an anthropocentric view on nature, but he did recognize that we can't just do whatever we want. There has to be limits. So he was about preserving nature, but he was about preserving it for future generations to use as well. So he advocated for the wise use of resources and the multiple use of those resources. And to accomplish that, he believed that the natural resources should be owned by the federal government. So the U.S. developed national forests, and those were considered a land of many uses. So you can use them for timber, you can use them for hunting, fishing, recreation, whatever. But this ethic did not include putting land aside for spiritual or aesthetic reasons. It was really for goods and services. So our next ethic, the last ethic, is the ecological evolutionary land ethic. And this was proposed by Aldo Leopold, which is the author of one of your required texts, the Sand County Almanac. This one right here. And he was from Burlington, Iowa. He actually graduated from the forestry school that Pinchot created at Yale, and he went to the program at Gray Towers in Pennsylvania. He worked as a forester. He worked in Arizona and New Mexico before they were even states. And he really emphasized game management. So he was all about sustainable harvesting when he was a forester. He was the founder of wildlife biology, and he founded a wildlife management school at the University of Wisconsin. He was also the first chair of an official wildlife biology department. And you're going to read a lot about his experiences in the next 5 weeks. He was a really important person for conservation biology. You're going to hear a lot about the different things that he's come up with. So, but back to the ethic. So the evolutionary ecological land ethic emphasized that there's intrinsic value in nature. So that's that nature has value in and of itself, regardless of what we can get from it. So this was not an anthropocentric view. This was a view that humans are a part of nature, but we are no more important than anyone else. We are just a part of the system. So nature is a complex and integrated system, and every single part of it is important. And when he said the land ethic, he didn't just mean the plants and animals. He meant the land, everything. So everything in nature is important. So there's a couple quotes from his book that are probably pretty important to understand. This quote says, "Ecology is a new fusion point for all of the sciences. The emergence of ecology has placed the economic biologist in a peculiar dilemma. With one hand, he points out that accumulated findings of his search for utility or lack of utility in this or that species. With the other, he lifts a veil from the biota so complex that conditioned by interwoven cooperations and competitions that no man can say where utility begins or ends." So this quote, what it does is it emphasizes the dilemma that conservation biologists have when we try to advocate for nature. So you're going to read about the land ethic in your reading this week, but it's really, it's emphasizing whether we should focus on the things that nature gives us, but there's also, it's such a complex environment that we need to also focus on everything and how it's interwoven and how every little part is important in this machine that is the environment. So he also said that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community, and it's wrong when it tends otherwise. So he really focuses on the morality of nature conservation. It wasn't about helping ourselves. It was about what is right and what we should do. And finally, he also says that all ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. The land simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include the soils, waters, plants, and animals. And in short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from the conqueror of the land to a member and citizen of it. So this is where he's straying from the other conservation ethics, because the other conservation ethics saw us as pretty much the leaders, and how the land is something that we can use. But here he wasn't looking at us in that way. He's looking at us as being a small part of the whole. And again, he wasn't just looking at plants and animals, which is something else that was different from the other ethics. He looked at the entire land, so the ecosystem, so the soil, the water, everything. It all mattered. And the last quote. So the last word in ignorance is the man who says of an animal or plant, what good is it? If the land mechanism as a whole is good, then every part is good, whether we understand it or not. If the biota in the course of eons has built something that we like but do not understand, then who but a fool would discard seemingly useless parts? To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. So again, he's stressing the fact that this is an interrelated system. And even though, for the example that I gave earlier, something like a tick, we think, what use is a tick, right? We don't like ticks, but everything has a use. We just may not understand it yet. So even if there's something that you're like, there's no use to that, it does have a reason for being in existence, right? And he is emphasizing that everything has a use, no matter whether we understand that use or not. It's all necessary. So when we look today, we wonder, where can we see these ethics? And they all still are in use today. There's not one ethic that's the right way or the wrong way. They all have their use, and they're all being used in what we have today. So the romantic transcendental preservation ethic is what you see for wilderness areas. These are areas that are set for us to go and look at, for us to hike through, but they're not used for taking in goods and services, right? We're using them just as aesthetic value or spiritual value. Then for the resource conservation ethic, we have our U.S. forests, and those are used for acquiring goods. U.S. forests, we will often do logging in U.S. forests. There's hunting allowed, right? There's fishing allowed. So we're seeing that ethic there. And then the ecological evolutionary land ethic are our wildlife management areas. So those are places that are cut off to sustain certain types of wildlife and to protect them. And we're not thinking about, oh, this wildlife is giving us this, right? We're thinking about the fact that they deserve to survive and they deserve an area to live. So we're still using all of these ethics. None of them disappeared. They're all still in use. So now we're going to get into the conservation laws and acts. So there's quite a few conservation laws that came forth. Laws are rooted in our ethics and our values. So we went through our ethics. Conservation biologists, it's our job to convince the public of the value of biodiversity and to maintain and expand the legal protection of biodiversity. So that's a big part in being a conservation biologist. So again, we have our legal foundations. We are going to go through all of these. Conservation legislation dates back to the 1800s, but there were also earlier game laws, so laws for hunting and harvesting. So in 1872, for example, there was legislation established to create the first national park, which was Yellowstone National Park. The Forest Reserve Act to set forests aside was 1891. The National Park Service was created in 1916. But again, we didn't start using science-based ideals for conservation biology until the 1970s and 1980s. So the first act that we're going to talk about is the Lacey Act. And the Lacey Act was originally enacted to supplement the state laws for protection of game and birds by prohibiting the transport of wild animals or birds that were killed in violation of the state or territorial law. So it was used to aid in enforcement. The act required that shipments of fish and wildlife moving in interstate or foreign commerce be accurately marked and labeled as to their contents. So it bans the trafficking of any illegal wildlife, and that can include wildlife that's protected and illegal to harvest at all, or it could even include game that was harvested in an illegal manner. So it could be you shot a deer outside a hunting season, that cannot be transported. And to prove that you shot them in hunting season, let's say it was legal, that's why we have tags. And that's why we accurately mark our hunting, our animals that we hunt. So that's part of the Lacey Act. That's why you need to buy a hunting tag. That's why you need to mark your deer or whatever you hunted. You need to mark them. It's to prove that it was taken legally, and it allows you then to transport it. There are still some other regulations in transporting, but this was the main one. So in the Lacey Act, violators of the Lacey Act are subject to criminal and civil sanctions. The prohibitions apply to all wild animals, whether dead or alive, and to any part, product, egg, or offspring, including captive bred animals. So it also applies more narrowly to certain wild plants indigenous to the U.S. So what this is saying is you can't even take an animal product over state lines if it doesn't have the proper documentation. So technically, you are not even supposed to pick up, like, let's say you find a skull on the ground in the woods. You're not supposed to transport that over state lines. Now, it's very rare that they will get you for something like that, but it's still something that technically under this act is not supposed to be done. And if they have any reason to believe that you did harvest an animal illegally, you can get in a lot of trouble. So the most significant amendment to the Lacey Act was enacted in 1981, and that expanded the scope of animals to include all wild animals, including those that were bred in captivity, and it included other wild plants. So in 2008, another amendment expanded it even more to include plants and plant products such as timber and paper. So now there is even a limit on how you can take timber across state lines. So you need to have proper documentation for that to prove that it was taken legally. So next we have the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and that was created between US and Britain, and other nations later joined. And what it does is it protects migratory birds. It was initially intended just for waterfowl, but it has been expanded, and it classifies birds into 3 categories. So you have game birds, insectivorous birds, and other non-game birds. So what it tells you is that you cannot take any of these birds at any time during the year. It's closed for 12 months for all birds except for game birds. And those have seasons on game birds. So it prohibits the take of nestlings, it prohibits the takes of eggs, and of any other bird. And when it says the take, what take means, it's including killing, capturing, selling, trading, transporting, any of that. So all of that is protected under the Migratory Bird Species, Bird Treaty Act. And the only way around any of this is if you get prior authorization from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So there are educational permits, right, to be able to take things. There are quite a few reasons why you can get an exemption, but you need documentation in order to do any of this, and the average person doesn't have that. So it protects all of our migratory birds. So next we had the Pittman-Robertson Act, and this is one that a lot of people don't know about, but it was still very important. It created a tax on firearms and ammunition. And when it says firearms, it's not just guns. It's including bows. And ammunition includes arrows. It also includes firearms that aren't used for hunting purposes. So anything you get for self-protection. This tax is on all of these things. And what the tax is used for is it's used to benefit wildlife. So, and all of these taxes go towards things like the acquisition of land or habitat when we're trying to preserve areas. It goes towards research and surveys, and it goes towards wildlife management. And the tax is actually what provides 75% of the costs that we have for our wildlife management. And the states will provide the other 25%, and that usually comes from things like hunting licenses. So really, it's the hunters and the gun owners that are keeping wildlife management going right now. They are pretty much funding most of our wildlife management. So we also have the National Environmental Policy Act, and that was enacted in 1969. And what that's saying is any actions taken by the federal government or under the nexus of the federal government have to prove that they're not going to negatively impact the environment. So they have to ensure that everyone is going to, all people are going to be safe, that any animals there are not endangered or in need of protection, and they're not going to impact the ecosystem in a way that will harm animals. So these are ways to keep companies keep the government from building up in certain areas or from doing anything that's going to be negative to the environment. And before they do anything, they have to complete something called an environmental assessment or an environmental impact survey. So the environmental assessment has to be filled out before any sort of land use is approved. It has a clear description of the action that they're proposing, a detailed description of the environment that's going to be affected, an assessment of any probable effects, an assessment of anything that might be an accidental risk, so anything that could happen, even if it's not expected to happen, a description of how the action affects the plans and policies of other government agencies, and a description of the reasonable alternatives and their probable effects. So this needs to be filled out anytime the government approves any sort of land use. And it really is to make sure that they're not going to impact the environment in a negative way. So they'll get a response back that will either be no impact and then they're clear, they can do whatever they need, or they'll get denied and then their project will not be able to happen in that place, or they'll need to come up with an alternative that won't impact the environment. So this is really an important thing. They can also be required to fill out an environmental impact statement, and that is used for more complex projects and ones that are more likely to have an impact on the environment. And what that is it's the entire environmental assessment, plus it's more extensive and more detailed. So they still have to have all that other stuff, but they make it more detailed and extensive. They also need to have teams of professionals to prepare for everything. They hold public meetings and they involve the public and get the public's concern on this project. And they require a lot more extensive documentation. So next, this one is a very important act. I'm sure you guys all know about this without even knowing you know about it. The Endangered Species Act. So what this did is its purpose was to protect and recover imperiled species and the ecosystems which they depend on. So it's administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Commerce Department's National Marine Fisheries. And it primarily has, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has responsibility for anything terrestrial or freshwater, and the marine fisheries have responsibility for marine wildlife, such as whales and fish. And under the Endangered Species Act, they defined what an endangered species is, which is a species in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant part of its range. And they also define threatened species, which are species that are likely to become an endangered species within the foreseeable future throughout all or a significant part of its range. And you'll notice, you would think that the term endangered species and threatened species have been around for a long time, but this was enacted in 1973, which was right around the time that all of that conservation stuff was happening. So this was during the large conservation movement. So what this is all species of plants and animals, except pest insects, are eligible to be listed as endangered or threatened. And for the purposes of the Endangered Species Act, Congress defined species to also include subspecies, varieties, and for vertebrates, even distinct population segments. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a whole species, right? It could be a specific subspecies that is endangered. So for any endangered or threatened species that were identified, organizations could start the listing process. So that would be the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. They would start the listing process. And that involved developing a recovery plan for that animal. So they have to identify critical habitat for the species, and they need to propose a way to recover the species. So this act is really about making sure our species that are endangered or threatened don't go extinct, because over the last couple hundred years we've seen quite a few extinctions that were pretty much, a lot of them our fault. So this was trying to slow that down and stop that. And we're going to talk a lot about some species that went extinct in a couple weeks. So there was some controversy surrounding the Endangered Species Act. Some people were concerned that it included subspecies and populations when identifying endangered species, and they thought that that was a problem because it leads to protections over populations that aren't necessarily threatened. So they were worried that we would be protecting too much, which, in my opinion, doesn't sound all that terrible. But I guess if you're one of the landowners and they're putting more stipulations on how you can run your business, it does become an issue for you. So they were concerned that some populations were being protected when they really didn't need it. So this one we're going to spend a few minutes on because this is a very large act that was put forth in, again, 1973. You notice it's the same year as the Endangered Species Act. So this act, the Convention of the International Trade in Endangered Species, otherwise known as CITES, was probably the most important international agreement that we've had in conservation biology. And what it does is it regulates or prohibits the commercial trade in endangered species or their products. This only involves trade between two or more countries, so it does not have any effect if it's trade within a country. So it's only if it's between countries. And the heart of CITES lies in its 3 appendices, which we will get into in a second. And they list the categories of subspecies regulated under the treaty. So for CITES, nations must sign on and agree and say that they agree to follow the laws of CITES. It's not something that all countries are automatically a part of. But we do have around 182 countries, as well as the European Union, that are currently members of CITES. So there's a lot of the world that are members of CITES. Feel free to check out that link that I included. You can see all of the species that are included under each of the appendices there, so you can see a whole list of all of the species in CITES. And if you choose the video for the video literature review, you're actually going to learn a little bit more about CITES, and you're going to learn about one of the success stories from a couple of years ago. So, like I said, there are 3 appendices, and the first one lists species that are endangered and vulnerable to existing or potential trade. So this is the highest level for them. And what this does is it prohibits trade in any species in Appendix 1. In order to trade any of these species, you must obtain permits from both the importing and exporting countries. And that's only for non-commercial trade. There is no commercial trade at all. So that's their highest level. So the second appendix is it lists species that could be threatened by large volumes of trade, and also it lists species that can't be distinguished from Appendix 1 species. So if you think that they may cause accidental capture and transport of an Appendix 1 species, they would be listed, then this species would be listed in Appendix 2. And trade involving any of those species requires a permit from the exporting country. So not even the importing country, just the exporting country. The third appendix lists species that are not considered globally endangered, but are listed because a country wants the cooperation in protecting these species. So other nations are asked not to permit the import of these species without a permit from the exporting country. He is so loud. So this is really this is really something that is up to the country, each country, to decide if there's anything that they think that they want to protect that's not necessarily listed under Appendix 1 or 2. Then they can petition to have it protected under Appendix 3. So we have all of these laws in place, right, to protect species. But why don't we hear about most of the species that need our help? When you hear about endangered species, we always hear about the same ones, like over and over and over again. And yeah, obviously those species need our help, but there are also so many more that need our help that we never hear about. So how do we decide which ones get the attention? And there's a few ways that we can decide this. There's a few ways that have been used to decide this. One way is to look at a keystone species. And keystone species are species that exert a disproportionate impact on the environment when you compare it to their biomass. So when you add up all the biomass of that individual of the species in an ecosystem, they would have a low biomass, but they'd be very important. Okay, so an example of this is starfish, and a biologist named Robert Payne actually researched starfish and found that even though they're super low in their numbers in their environment, they're integral to the environment. And if you take them out, the entire ecosystem will collapse. So you're actually going to read about this in your readings this week in Where the Wild Things Were. So keystone species, they got their name because they're named after the keystone, this right here, in arches. So that's a stone at the center top. And if you remove this stone, the entire arch collapses. So it's really the stone that holds it all together. That's where they got their name. Another way that we can, another example of a keystone species are sea otters. So sea otters, they feed on urchins. And when an otter is removed, the sea urchins increase in abundance and they actually eliminate all the seaweeds. And seaweeds are an important habitat and food source for many species. So in an area that naturally has sea otters, by removing them, you kind of cause an ecological collapse in that area. So they really are a keystone species. So another type of species that we look at and decide this is what we're going to advocate for are umbrella species. And these are species that are selected for making conservation-related decisions because protecting them indirectly protects a lot of other species that make up the ecological community of its habitat. So, for example, the mountain lion is an umbrella species. And even though in some areas mountain lions aren't of any particular concern, they still have a very large range. And by protecting them and their habitat, all of the other animals in their range are also being protected. Another example of an umbrella species would be the spotted owl. And spotted owls live in old growth forests. So when we protect the forest for the spotted owl, we also are protecting all the other animals in that old growth forest. Another type of species that we will work on protecting are indicator species. And what indicator species are is these are species that are very sensitive to the biological and environmental changes in the environment. So we know when an ecosystem isn't doing well because the species will be the first to decline. And great indicator species for water and air quality are amphibians. So they're very sensitive to any changes in the environment, and they're really the first indicator that the environment is going downhill. Another indicator species are lichens. Again, they're sensitive to environmental changes, so they're great indicators of a healthy environment. And if they start to decline, we know that something is happening in the environment that we might not have seen yet with our naked eye or whatever. We wouldn't have noticed as early, but the lichen lets us know that something's changing and we know to fix it. So another type of species are flagship species. And what these are species that people simply like and they want to protect. So they carry the flag for conservation. They're ones that we can use to represent our conservation effort. And they're usually charismatic megafauna. So for example, the panda is the logo for the World Wildlife Fund for a reason, right? There are more endangered species out there that could have been chosen, but pandas are so widely liked, they're adorable, and people are more likely to take an interest in conservation if they're seeing an animal that they enjoy looking at or that they think is cute, or that gives them some sort of happy feeling by looking at them. So that's a flagship species. And another obvious example of a flagship species would be a bald eagle, right? Especially in this country because they're our national animal. So people want to protect bald eagles. And there's some areas where bald eagles they're not doing too poorly. They're doing pretty great. But there's still something that everyone enjoys seeing, right? There's something that we all like to look at. So they're a great animal to use as a symbol of our conservation efforts. And we will actually talk a little bit about bald eagles and our conservation efforts with them because they're actually a pretty good success story at this moment. They were not doing very well a while back, but we have brought them back into pretty high numbers now. And we'll talk about that later in the couple weeks. Then we have our taxonomically unique species. So what this means is that they are the only member or one of a few members of their taxon. So Tuatara, for example, are the only species in a whole order of reptiles. So when we think about groups of reptiles, we might think snakes, lizards, turtles, crocodilians, right? And Tuatara do kind of look like a lizard, but they're not. They're actually their own group, and they're the only surviving member. So they can only be found in a certain region of New Zealand, and if they were to go extinct, we would lose an entire order of reptiles. So that's a reason to protect something because it's so unique. Another taxonomically unique species would be the Solenodon. A lot of you might not have heard of Solenodons, but they are nocturnal, burrowing, insectivorous animals, and they're actually one of the only venomous mammals. So the other venomous mammal would be the platypus, right? But with a platypus, they have a venomous spine on their back legs. The Solenodon is the only mammal that injects its venom in a similar way to venomous snakes. So they actually have teeth with grooves in them, and the venom will flow through the grooves, and when they bite, you will get injected with venom. So there's only two living Solenodon species. There's the Cuban Solenodon and the Hispaniolan Solenodon, and those are the only places you can find them is Cuba and Hispaniola. So they're really not very widely known. But again, they're taxonomically unique, so there's something that we would work to conserve. So that is it for this lecture.